Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we'll discuss a module from Translation Studies, and the module is on translation and the philosophy of language. The content of this module is written by Abhishek Sarkar. A language itself, in its very essence, is already a translation. First from the non-verbal world, and then because each sign and each phrase is a translation of another sign and another phrase. This is a comment made by Octavio Paz. Translation has down the edges been seen as a bridge between the cultural and the linguistic others, but one is never sure about the nature of the bridge. The writers, translators, and translation theorists are critically divided on their opinion of the centrality of translation as a process of linguistic exchange. The quotation above shows that Paz advocates a rather radical conclusion. Language itself is born out of translation. This has not been the received view of translation theorists until recently. Although Paz echoes the basic tenets of the modern structuralist version of linguistics, which looks at language as a set of signs that share no essential relation with the world of objects. He does not exactly reiterate Saussure's argument. He extends it further. Ferdinand de Saussure proposed that linguistic signs are arbitrary and twice removed from the objects they refer to. There is a real tree out there, materially and tangibly existent. Then there is a perception of the tree, and there is then an attempt to name it as tree. The spelled out English word Paz follows the basic logic of this proposal and then looks into it through the lens of translation, the exchange of meaning. His chief interest here is not the definiteness of meaning, but how it is born and carried forward from one sign system to another. He facilitates serious enquiry so as to find out if, when we utter the English word, we really mean the materially existent tree, or if the meaning lies in the conception of that existent object. So translation for him transcends the contingency of language contact and appears as the essential trigger of cognition, the formation of language. Traditionally, however, translation in the West has been considered a simple operation that involves carrying the meaning expressed in one language to the other, a process of semantic transfer establishing a map of synonymous words, phrases. This view is radically opposed to that of Paz, not only because it projects translation as a consequence of language use, but also because it limits translation within the ambits of communicative sign system. Theories of equivalence in translation studies have been fostered by this view. Since the time of Saint Jerome's categorization of two types of translation as sense for sense and word for word, the study of equivalence, synonym between the linguistic expressions across languages, has been central to any discourse of translation. Apparently, the word for word and the sense for sense translations owe their origins to two conflicting views on language. While the former bases itself on the belief that meaning can be preserved interlingually with the help of formal linguistic phraseology, chiefly by lexical and syntactic correspondences, and the latter frees itself from grammaticalization by addressing the functionality of language use. There is scope for further fine graining. Nonetheless, as has been mentioned earlier, they share an underlying agreement. Translation is the offspring of language and not the other way around. One may divide the discourses on translation and its relation to the philosophy of language into two broad categories: the sign to sign translation, the transfer of meaning from one language to the other, or from one Semitic system to the other, which incorporates the concepts of interlingual and intersemitic translation coined by Jacobson, and the cognitive translation, the process of conceiving the world around. Sign to sign translation and the philosophy of language. It would not be unjust to claim that translation studies, even in late 20th century, was revolving around various terminological reformulations of the word-to-word and sense-to-sense translation. It is this predominance of equivalence that lays such enormous emphasis on the concepts of the source and the target language. Gottlob Frege's distinction between meaning and sense will be dealt with in a while. For the time being, we just need to mention that Frege, in his deliberations on the philosophy of language, articulated that two linguistic expressions, although denote the same things, may not share an identical meaning. For instance, the evening star and the morning star might denote the same star, but they cannot always replace each other. It was dark outside, only the evening star was twinkling in the sky, etc. The scholars advocating sense for sense translation draw strength from Frege's 1892 essay on sense and reference in many a way. If two words sharing identical references may differ in sense, then the whole idea of synonym falls apart and interlingual word-for-word equivalent turns out to be a mere utopia. Not only did he address a problem faced by early translation theorists such as Cicero, Horace, Dryden, etc., but also cast a lasting influence on 20th century scholars. We will digress briefly and take a look at some of the major threads that connected linguistics and translation theories in the mid 20th century. NIDA in 1964, influenced by the generative school of linguistics pioneered by Chomsky, proposes that the real meaning of a proposition is to be found in the kernel sentence, which would imply that if one has to translate, "Do you want to go there?" the translator must try to find the equivalence for the phrase "you want to go there," which Chomsky proposed is transformed into the former surface structure by means of transformational rules. So, in the target language, once the translator has gained access to the camel proposition, the surface structure may be derived thereafter. This is NIDA's proposal of dynamic equivalence, a close relation of the sense for sense translation. With the upsurge of syntactic computation in the arena of linguistics, it was thought that language systems are meaning-neutral formal computational models. No wonder NIDA believed that the essence of interlingual correspondences must be found in that computational system, not in words per se. The semantics, and especially lexical semantics, was a mere historical accident, and hence the variant of word-for-word translation that he calls formal equivalence is not regarded very highly by him. Catford in 1965 endorses the functionalist school of linguistics led by Halliday. The philosophical difference between Chomsky and Halliday might have been paramount when it comes to linguistics and the philosophy of language, but translation theories revolving around their proposals could not strike a major distinction between themselves. While the generative school claimed that the knowledge of language is innate and essentially modular, formal and computational, and that meaning was extended and epiphenomenal, the functionalists were of the opinion that to represent information through speech, which language facilitates so elegantly, the speaker must go beyond formal computations, and hence categories like cataphor and anaphor played key roles in the functional grammar. Catford's search for sense equivalence exceeds the syntactic boundaries and resorts to the whole text. He introduces a new category textual equivalent, where the importance of the context of language is use is emphasized upon. The functionalist school also inspired House, who introduced the concept of overt and covert translation. A covert translation may not be radically recognized as a translation, as it retains the basic message of the source text and not the verbatim meaning. One may also note Peter Newmark and Goethe's dependence on language use a decade after House. This brief discussion on mid-20th century translation theories would help us understand why the analytical school of philosophy had reduced translation to mere test of meaningfulness, an empirical exercise without much philosophical significance. Translation theories mentioned and many of their likes claimed affiliation from different and radically opposed schools of language philosophy, but ended up scouting for the site of Frege's sense, which in itself was considered an important exercise in the philosophy of language, and especially in semantics. But one may note that it contributes to philosophical generalizations about meaning instead of asserting the philosophical significance of translation as a process. Linguistic or as a process, linguistic or otherwise. So translation seen through the lens of the Fregean dichotomy fails to project its philosophical autonomy. Why so? Frege contested Russell on definiteness. If a definite description is co-referential with another definite description that denotes the same object, then meaning must be extensional, which is to say that semantic contents is to be found in the object of denotation. If Frege and the philosopher we are talking about right now share the identical semantic content, then the meaning has to be found in the person Frege and not in the linguistic unit like the word Frege. Frege argues that definite descriptions are not always mutually substitutable, as has been shown in the morning star, evening star example. Also, there are definite descriptions of entities that do not exist at all. The unicorn, phoenix, or maybe Voldemort. Where do their meanings come from? Refuting Russell, Frege could establish conclusively the meaning is intentional. It is there in the language and not in the object referred. But then, what exactly is that intentionally like? What is there in the word Frege that distinguishes it from the philosopher we are talking about right now? Frege proposes that it is the sense of the word that overrides its meaning here. But sense could not be located. Translation became the empirical site of testing meaning, transfer and locating Frege's sense. Frege, Russell and Wittgenstein questions if meaning could be found in the determinacy of word as a semantic construct, but the fullest appraisal of the interdeterminacy of meaning takes shape in W.V.O. Quinn's Word and Object 1960 and by Donald Davidson. Quinn writes translation of its empirical status and establishes the philosophical significance of the enterprise. He opines that meaning is neither content in a word nor a sentence, but in the whole of language. This might immediately hark back to the Catford's textual equivalence if we are not cautioned against drawing abrupt conclusions, since one has no access to the other's intentions. Hence, interpretation is, in principle, completely arbitrary and synonymous across languages in whatever form, be it the semantic meaning or sense, is evasive. Quinn concludes that translation is undermined by all possible evidences. It is always possible to interpret the sentences of a language in different and incompatible ways, all consistent with the totality of admissible evidence. Interpretive evidence for Quinn is limited to the state of the world and the states of human mind. Hence, the cross-cultural transfer of meaning seems either impossible or merely a charity. An agreement with the other so as to share a common belief and not to subject the proposition to logical fallacy. Translation is not so much a transfer as an original intervention which is both behavioral and cultural. The place of transfer is usurped by radical translation. In his project of translation, an ethnographer faces the task of translating a wholly unfamiliar language, and it is shown that the translation could very well be possible or even probable in case there are behavioral and environmental cues in place. Hence, it is not about carrying the sense but about creating it. This leads us to the belief that translation may be seen more as a cognitive issue than a sign-to-sign transfer. Now let us talk about cognitive translation and the philosophy of language. Radical translation brings the philosophical speculations about translation to the juncture where anthropology meets epistemic concerns. Translation, as a site of meaning making, construes the knowledge of the world around. What is knowledge after all? It is not the world of object itself. The natural sciences are categorically different from the nature. It is the knowledge of nature, the meaning in a broader sense. When Quinn questions the very possibility of meaning transfer, we come close to asking how is communication possible then? If translation is absolutely relative, then how to account for determinate meaning sharing that we undertake during the act of communication? Quinn here invokes the idea of stimulus meaning. Certain kinds of meanings that are shared because of external stimulus. For instance, if one utters, "that is a rabbit," the other might readily translate it with a promise of retaining the meaning into a different target language. But this determinacy is not there anywhere in the languages involved. The determinacy is a resultant of shared experience, of shared external stimulus. It would not in any way suggest that the word rabbit in English has any intrinsic connect, a synonym with its so-called equivalent in the target language. It must be made clear that Quinn by no means should be confused with the leaders of the cognitive scientific enterprises in contemporary times. It's just to say that the scope of his explorations may be extended to those arenas. As Lindell puts it, undetermination is an epistemological thesis about what can be known concerning the belief of the other. Quinn makes the scope for a more radical thesis of indeterminacy, suggesting it is not only in principle impossible to determine what the other means in uttering a statement, but that there is no objective fact of the matter at stake concerning what the other means. Quinn is not saying that there are two stable systems of meaning that are so foreign to each other that meaning cannot be transferred. He simply suggests that there is only translation. Meaning is relativized by the schemes of translation. There is no meaning independent of translation. Davidson rejects what Kirk calls Quine's semantic nihilism and proposes that a formal theory of translation is possible in spite of the indeterminacy that is all pervasive in language. He rejects Quine's proposal of stimulus meaning and states, I suggest we give up the idea that meaning or knowledge is grounded on something that counts as an ultimate source of evidence. No doubt, meaning and knowledge depend on experience, and experience ultimately on sensation. But this is the depend of causality, not of evidence of justification. Davidson speak it in 1986. Davidson's proposal does not thwart Quine's take on translation completely, but rather adds up by stating that the meaning of a proposition is not dependent directly on external stimulus, but on understanding under which conditions the proposition holds true. In his opinion, translation does not seem to be a meaning matching task that a real act of transfer or transcription requires. It rather proceeds by matching sentences with identical truth conditions. So, like for NIDA, for Davidson also, translation is a purely syntactic notion, but Davidson's model is more elegant and better suited for philosophical purposes. Human cognition is, for him, a process of formal computation, and meaning is but a practical decision. This sums up Davidson's idea of radical interpretation. Davidson plays down cultural specificity and asserts that it would not be wise to think that speakers in different languages think in so different a way as to render anything untranslatable. Human cognition, then, although subject to agreements, may not transcend an unproblematic rationality that is stable across cultures. Not only Davidson, but even Quine talked about the idea of charity, which signifies taking the other's statement, proposition as a rational one and not to subject it to logical fallacies. Derrida questions this basic assumption that we may render the belief of the other rationally interpretable, or to be more precise, to render the indeterminate determinate. He opines that there could be no philosophy of translation unless we came to terms with the translation of philosophy. Translation for him is a passage to philosophy, while rationalism is just a school of philosophy. If translation is a process of meaning creation and the task of a philosopher is to crystallize concepts and common sense beliefs into maxims and premises, then the philosopher achieves what she does by the method of translation. And hence it won't be prudent to take rationality as the foundation of translation. He marks that belief systems can be and often indeed are so radically different that translation not only fails to retain the meaning of any reversed original but also contributes newer beliefs to the target. A constant transaction of making and unmaking of meaning is what defines translation. In a very different context, Charles Fillmore, Kay, and other philosophers of the cognitive scientific school struck a balance between the absolute indeterminacy and the determinate rational transit. Fillmore et al. Propose that meanings are associated conceptual schemes or in their terminology frames. If I utter the word cricket, I end up activating a whole frame of concepts associated with it: bat, bowler, wicket, pitch, etc. Following Derrida's logic, then a culturally peculiar expression must find its niche somewhere in the given frames of the members of a target culture, in which case it loses some of its specificities and gains some others, or must add to the conceptual world a new frame. that contributes to the expansion of the belief system in the target culture. This simple theory addresses several issues raised by Quinn and Derrida in details. Cognitive linguistics has not yet put much emphasis on translation as their domain of studies, but further explorations might unravel interesting truth now dormant as possibilities. And now let us summarize the whole discussion. Through this discussion, we tried to find out the philosophy of translation, and to do this, we initially talked about the language and how language is how language itself is translation by in its philosophical flavor. When Octavio Paz claimed that all the languages are translation itself because it's all about the transferring of meaning, it's all about defining the objects, we understood that language itself is translation. And from there, we went to the various definitions and categories of translation by the theorists like Eugene Nider, Roman Jakobson, and we tried to find the philosophy of translation through linguistic communication and linguistic transformation of meanings and etc. And rather, we discussed Quinn, we discussed Derrida and their philosophy of language, and how that philosophy of language is related with the very notion of translation. We also proposed for new area of study, that is cognitive linguistics, which till now does not pay much attention to the translation studies, but we proposed we observed the possibility of this field of research. When much work will be done on this field, then we will be able to discover much about the philosophy of translation. And through this discussion, we understood it that philosophy of translation itself is very much intrinsic with the philosophy of language. And that is why we have to understand the philosophy of language and different approaches to the language, meaning generation, and the relation between meaning and the object, and the changes of meaning based on the existence of objects in different cultures. So we have to understand all these issues of languages related and differed in different cultures. And this is how we can find the philosophy, or more inclusive, more wider philosophy of translation. Thank you.